28. The lowest common denominator. The Messianic utopianism of early educators often took extravagant form as claims were made that prisons, crime, sin, war, tyranny, and every form of evil and disharmony would disappear with the triumph of universal statist education. This same expectation, in more sophisticated form, is the premise of the more modern drive to attain the great community. But it should be noted that in the early years the educators were far surpassed in their extravagance by the Unitarian clergy. Although other churches made their contributions to the movements and the New England theocracy absorbed the cause, as we have seen with reference to Sheldon, it was Unitarianism in particular which gave itself wholeheartedly to the cause of Messianic education and statism. The influence of that church on 19th century America is too seldom appreciated. Unitarianism was, in a sense, the American establishment of its day, and its influence was so pervasive as to render institutional Unitarianism as at best peripheral. Other churches felt its influence, and the schools reflected its faith. The McGuffey readers, in spite of their author's own background, reflected the non-theological and Unitarian common faith of their day and served ably to further it. Institutional Unitarianism underrated itself because it had a marginal doctrine of the Church. It sought establishments in a very real sense in and through the schools, and the schools became the embodiment and establishment of Unitarian faith. The Church thereafter became progressively irrelevant to the American scene as the schools became steadily the working embodiments of the Unitarian faith in salvation by statist education. The relationship of Unitarianism, statism, and statist education in the United States is an important, if neglected, area of 19th century history. There was resistance from various sectors, however, and notably from the Orthodox Calvinists of the day, who viewed with suspicion not only the Unitarians, but the developments of New England's ostensible orthodoxy. For them, New England Puritanism and Congregationalism, however much professing adherence to Calvinism, had departed from it at least since Jonathan Edwards's day. Edwards's Neoplatonism had extensively coloured subsequent New England orthodoxy. The departures of such men as Hopkins and Bellamy from the faith have often been noted, although their greatness has been too little appreciated. Unitarianism, however, was the consistent development of their anthropocentric premises and carried the day. Against all these theological tendencies and against statist education, Archibald Alexander Hodge, Princeton theologian and Orthodox Calvinist, made a forthright stand. He saw the statist claim that self-preservation of the state required statist education as a denial of the competence of other agencies as well as of their right to self-preservation. Moreover, the tendency of the entire system is to centralization. It enthroned also the radically fallacious idea that secular and atheist opinions and approaches to education were neutral, while religious approaches were partial and prejudiced. Hodge insisted that the statist approach was as fully committed and sectarian as any other, that it was indeed an establishment of an immediate minimum theism, but, in actual fact, an ultimate atheism. I am sure, as I am sure of Christ's reign, that a comprehensive and centralized system of national education separated from religion, as is now commonly proposed, will prove the most appalling enginery for the propagation of anti-Christian and atheistic unbelief and of antisocial nihilistic ethics, individual, social, and political, which this sin-rent world has ever seen. But more than that, Hodge saw as basic to the whole concept of statist education and its hostility to religion a dangerous principle in operation, that of the supremacy of the lowest common denominator. The tendency is to hold that this system must be altogether secular. The atheistic doctrine is gaining currency, even among professed Christians and even among some bewildered Christian ministers, that an education provided by the common government should be entirely emptied of all religious character. Protestants object to the government schools being used for the purpose of inculcating the doctrines of the Catholic Church, and the Romanists object to the use of the Protestant version of the Bible and to the inculcation of the peculiar doctrines of the Protestant churches. The Jews protest against the schools being used to inculcate Christianity in any form, and the atheists and agnostics protest against any teaching that implies the existence and moral government of God. It is capable of exact demonstration that if every party in the state has the right of excluding from the public schools whatever he does not believe to be true, then he that believes most must give way to him that believes least, and then he that believes least must give way to him that believes absolutely nothing, no matter in how small a minority the atheists or the agnostics may be. It is self-evident that on this scheme, if it is consistently and persistently carried out in all parts of the country, the United States system of national popular education will be the most efficient and wide instrument for the propagation of atheism which the world has ever seen. This statement, widely reprinted in recent years, was of course prophetic. The principle of the lowest common denominator steadily excluded not only religious teaching, and of late, even Christian carols in some schools, but also subjects regarded as anti-democratic or too scholastic. It has led to a steady lowering of reading requirements and the debasing of the curriculum in the name of democracy. But the effect of this principle of the lowest common denominator has been more than educational. As a political philosophy, it has been nothing less than a new religion, whose character is essentially totalist. In terms of this faith, which is the lodestar and guiding principle of contemporary foreign and domestic policies, integration downward becomes a religious necessity. Christian missions reach out to the lowest in the faith that the highest, God, can by his sovereign grace exalt them. Contemporary foreign aid is based on a levelling principle whereby the most advanced nation has a guilty obligation to the most backward and must impoverish itself for absolution from this sin. The property owner must be taxed heavily to provide for the indigent, who has a privileged status with the state as the lowest common denominator. Indeed, the welfare recipient is today the central object of care and subsidy, which, instead of removing the evils it seeks to cure, furthers them. Basic to the principle of the lowest common denominator is a hatred of excellence and of any law other than that which emanates from the lowest. The state, in terms of this radical democracy, ceases to be the instrument of justice and social order and becomes a class weapon, and the law of the state becomes the law of the pack. The Constitution embodied a different conception of the state. First of all, it set forth not the principles of majority or minority rule, but the supremacy of law, law understood in terms of a higher law or absolute law background. Second, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights saw liberty as the byproducts of limitations on government power, not the objective of its existence. Our rights, as the framers conceived them, were essentially certain specified immunities. They were not claims on, but assurances against the government. Third, it followed from this that government is the responsibility of a self-governing people, not as now, that people are the responsibilities of government. The principle of the lowest common denominator is reducing a self-governing and free people to a governed and slave people. The enthronement of this principle has coincided with imperialism, whether in Rome, Russia, or the United States. We have seen Colonel Parker's enthusiastic faith. I await the regeneration of the world from the teaching of the common schools of America. The dying Emma Marwaddle declared, I believe in the power of the kindergarten to reform the world. The principles of the kindergarten are today enthroned in Congress and in the White House. The children of the state Its citizens and the children of the world are to be saved by the Messianic state. The enthronement of the lowest goes hand in hand with the assumption that the Messianic state can assume the responsibilities of all men and nations, keep world peace, save world civilization, and usher in paradise regained. But, inevitably, the lowest common denominator is chaos. In ancient fertility cults, which, as genetic faiths, enthroned the lowest as the primary, a ritual return to chaos was held to be the means to social regeneration. The fixed, lawful, and rational were late and higher developments and hence less basic and also seen as essentially sterile. Closeness to the primitive was closeness to creativity and vitality, and chaos itself was the principle of regeneration. Saturnalia, the primitive festival, orgies, rituals involving confusion in the forms of incest, bestiality, or perversion were necessary rites and means of social regeneration. In fact, the festival is presented as the reenactment of the first days of the universe, the Urzeit, the eminently creative era. The rebirth of nature and the rebirth of society both require the return to chaos as the principle of life. The festival is thus celebrated in the context of the myth and assumes the function of regenerating the real world. Beginning with the Romantic movement, art, poetry, music, and novel have vigorously pursued the principle of primitivism, the genetic faith in the lowest common denominator. This genetic faith has had its scientific versions in Darwin and post-Darwinian thinking and in Freud. Politically, the faith in rootless revolutions, revolutions dedicated to radical destruction and a break with the past, is another instance of the myth of the creative power of chaos. Lenin defined both the chaos struggle and true morality as in essence the destruction of existing order. In Western democracies, this same faith in revolution has been held with variations. Revolution is believed in as far as other countries, backward ones in particular, are concerned. Somehow, the destruction of existing, if faulty order, will thereupon enable the society to transcend itself by virtue of the mystical baptism in chaos. The genetic fallacy, as an aspect of the scientific mythology of the age, has permeated an education already dedicated to the principle of the lowest common denominator. Evolution sees primitive world forces as determinative and creative. Psychoanalysis sees the libido, or whatever else it holds to be the primal power, as the basic life force. The varied world of art seeks creativity in primitive chaos, or in primal forms and impulses. Foreign policies are geared to the lowest common denominators, or to hopes in revolutionary chaos. The total result is, to use Cornelius Van Til's apt expression, a vast integration into the void. A realistic appraisal of our time requires recognition of this grim fact. Chaos is the goal of contemporary human endeavour. Chaos is thus not a threat, but an objective. For those who believe that liberty is the concomitant of law and of order, the answer rests clearly upon man to accept, instead of the genetic fallacy, the sovereignty of the ontological Trinity. God, the sovereign creator and redeemer. God, the self-determined one, has created man in his image, and man's self-government and responsibility under God in Christ is a restoration of liberty and order to a fallen world. Men who truly know themselves to be bought with a price and adopted into the glorious liberty of the sons of God will not become the slaves of men and of the state. James Oppenheim, in his poem, The Slave, expressed it thus: "They can only set free men free. There is no need of that. Free men set themselves free."